Right, so somebody in the comments asked if I could quickly go over what the 10-mark questions look like and what the best way is to try and pick up the most amount of marks on these kinds of questions. Because the question paper's out of 80, and obviously, you know, if one of those is worth 10, that's a significant percentage of the paper just on one question, on one 10-mark question. So here's an example of one from a previous paper. It's asking us to discuss the impacts of the Data Protection Act. Questions on the Data Protection Act, they come up quite regularly on these exam papers because legislation's a big chunk, obviously, of information and the sharing and storing of global information. So this particular exam was based on a case study that it was about a travel company that sent information about people's dogs and quarantine and paperwork, etc., around the world. Some of the paperwork went outside of the EU. Some of the paperwork remained in the EU, but there was still the issue of storage and transmitting data to countries that weren't necessarily covered by the Data Protection Act or, you know, the new equivalent, the GDPR. So here's the case study. There's a little bit of information here, and as we can see, it tells us that, you know, there are dogs traveling to places like Australia. So we're moving outside of the EU. It's the usual kind of excerpt from the database, and there's the general case study here that gives us a little bit of information about it. Okay, so the question is asking us to discuss the impacts of the Data Protection Act on this company when handling personal information regarding the dog and the owner of that dog. So there is some expectation that you understand the Data Protection Act, that you understand the principles of the Data Protection Act, that you understand the role of the Information Commissioner when it comes to actually putting that Data Protection Act into practice and so on. So it would be, before we look at the actual mark scheme here, it would be useful to see how they break it down. So you can see that there is clearly 3 tiers in terms of the way that these kind of questions are marked by the exam board. So if you're at a level 1 response, then you've identified some points that are relevant, but you haven't really used any examples or referred back to the case study to support your argument. So your answer's a little bit basic. It's not particularly well structured. It's not particularly well communicated. It's not really supported by anything to, you know, give your answer a bit more weight and credibility. And so it's in the kind of lower mark bands, okay? If we look up to the level 2 mark band, there's more of a kind of demonstration in your answer that you know what the question is asking you. You understand the impacts of the Data Protection Act. Your explanations are pretty solid, but you may only have mentioned one major impact, but you have been quite descriptive. You've gone into some depth with your answer. You've got some examples to support what it is you're trying to say. But occasionally it may be slightly off topic, or the examples might not be the best. So you're kind of stuck at this middle level 2 mark band structure. So to pull the full 7 to 10 marks out of this question, you need to be in this level 3 mark band. And the moderator is telling us that the answer needs to be detailed. You need to be demonstrating that you really do understand what the Data Protection Act is about. You understand what the impacts of not maybe following the Data Protection Act or just having the Data Protection Act in place, what the impact is on this organization. There is a clear, structured, sensible, relevant discussion of more than one impact, and it is fully applied to the case study and to the organization within the case study. Any supporting examples that you've come up with, they're clearly relevant and they clearly support what it is you're trying to say. The answer is, it's logical, it's developed. There's a line of reasoning in there which makes perfect sense. It's not just waffle. You've not just thrown down all the things you could remember in some unstructured mishmash of a smorgasbord of ideas. There's some structure. It makes sense, okay? And it's relevant, and it's a substantial answer to a question. Now, what the exam board will do is they'll give you lines to write on the answer paper. The expectation is generally that you can answer the question in the lines they give you. So don't waffle, don't talk nonsense. If you do need a bit of extra space, there is additional space on the back. But try and keep your answer down to the lines they've given you by making sure that you're getting to the point and you're not talking about things that aren't relevant, okay? So these are some of the things that the exam board have suggested were, good responses to this question, okay? So again, if you read through, you can see in their indicative content of what a good answer looks like on this exam. There's understanding of the Data Protection Act. There's understanding of the Information Commissioner. There's understanding of how it relates to the case study. So the first suggestion is a data controller must be appointed. You need to register with the Information Commissioner. This person has responsibility within this organisation in the case study. Talks about the fact that there are 8 principles in the Data Protection Act, and you need to kind of be understanding a little bit about what that means then for the organisation. So it moves on to explain that this company must be clear on what information about the dog and the owner, because they're the 2 things in the exam question, are collecting, why they're collecting it, what it's going to be used for. Okay, so that links into the Data Protection Act and the regulations around what you can collect and how long you can keep in it, and the fact that it's going to be up to date and so on. So the case study again must inform the Information Commission as to what they're going to do with this information, and only collect and process the information that meets these specific and specified requirements, okay? You should only request information that's relevant. It must be checked to ensure it's up to date, okay? These all link in to the principles of the Data Protection Act. When the dog has travelled and is back with its owners, information that's no longer required should be purged from the system. If information is held, but it's wrong, or it's incomplete, or it hasn't been updated, then the owners of those dogs have a legal right to ask that that is updated or even removed from the system. There's a whole issue around security. It's their responsibility as an organisation to prevent unauthorised access to this information. And they should be ensuring that there's backups of this information. So, obviously, you don't want to be restoring backups from like a month ago, and now you've just all of a sudden in one fell swoop got loads of out-of-date information within your database in your system. Okay? And the big one, if the country is outside of the EU or to a country that does not have adequate levels of protection, then they must get consent of the owner to transfer the information to the destination country. Otherwise, it is illegal to transfer that information. Okay? And there's always this little bit at the bottom. There may be something that the examiner, the moderator, has come up with, or you may have come up with something different. And that's fine as long as it's valid and it makes sense and it relates to the case study and you've kind of supported your answer there. So that's fine. So there's always this option to have come up with another idea. And moderators are very good at marking exams. They do this all the time. Okay, so if we look down and just quickly see what the examiner is saying for this particular question. Okay, so candidates were awarded marks based on the level of detail, the application of their response to the case study, the quality of the response in terms of use of technical IT computing related language, and it kind of is logical, it's reasoned, it's not just thrown together unstructured ideas that you just suddenly had. Okay, so the focus of the question was on the Data Protection Act. No credit was gained for just saying that the Data Protection Act has 8 principles and you know, maybe given some examples of what they are. They have to be related to the case study and they have to be related to the question. Most candidates were able to provide one impact. Most people focused on security. That's fine. You're just limiting your ability to get higher grades if you're only focusing on one impact and you're only focusing on one area of the Data Protection Act. To reach the highest mark band, candidates needed to have provided a detailed discussion of more than one impact. Okay, so the question asks for impacts. Okay, so there is an example here of some student work which would have landed somewhere in the medium level mark band. Okay, so they've talked again so we can see security, keeping data safe, relates to the case study. Okay. It ensures the data will not be hacked or edited. So again, security related stuff. And as we keep going down, we can see all of the rest of the answer continues to be just talking about the safety of customer information and keeping that information secure. So one impact, one issue, doesn't really go into any more detail than that, stuck in that kind of middle 5-6 mark category there. Okay, you can see here the higher level answer is talked about complying with all principles of the Data Protection Act, and then there are some examples here of a couple of those. It's mentioned one principle, it's mentioned another principle. Okay, and then he's also mentioned the transportation, so moving outside the UK. So we've got a couple, 2 or 3 potential principles here from the Data Protection Act with some explanation of what that looks like in terms of the case study, with some explanation of what the impact of that law is, or it could be the reverse of that. It could be the impact of if they don't keep to the law and they fail to uphold that legislative, legal requirement, and what happens then. Okay, so we can see here from the commentary, there's references to more than one principle of the Data Protection Act, clearly references how the case study company can follow these. There's a reasonable attempt for it to be a discussion. There's references to more than one impact, although they are a little bit superficial. Examples have been provided. They are limited in their application to the case study. So it's a good high-level answer. Didn't get the full 10 marks, but probably landed somewhere around about 7, possibly 8 marks. Okay? So how could they have gone on and got the full 10, full whack, of marks available on this particular question? Well, all the examples provided to support the answer needed to be related to the case study. And it needs to be a discussion about the impacts, and it needs to be specifically about holding of personal information. Why? Because that's what the question was asking us to do. For example, one of the points made was that personal information needs to be protected, and then they go on to talk about implementing different security measures. They give an example of encryption, but they didn't really mention the impact of the implementation of those security measures on the company. So they didn't talk about how it's going to cost them money and time and staff and so on in order to implement these measures. Okay, so you just need to think about it logically. Think about what the question is asking you. Read the question a couple of times before you dive in with your answer. Think logically about how it relates to the case study. Think about what the case study is telling us about what's going on, and then write an answer that is logical and sensible and supported with some answers. And, try and think about, when you finished it, maybe skim read through it and ask yourself, does it look like a lower mark band answer, a middle mark answer, or, is there something else maybe I could add that will just push it that little bit higher into maybe one of the other mark bands a little bit further up. Okay, so hopefully that's been of some help. Good luck in your exam. Hopefully everything will go well, and I'm sure you guys will all do great.